Alisa Martin had always been a walking disaster wrapped in an oversized blazer, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared her for the catastrophe that was her first day at Dax Corporation. She bolted into the building, hair in a tangled mess, clutching a half-empty coffee cup, only to collide headfirst with a broad-shouldered man in the elevator. The impact sent her bag flying, her phone skidding across the floor, and as if the universe had a cruel sense of humor, the last sip of her coffee landed right on his crisp, undoubtedly expensive suit.
Hello, I'm the storyteller of the channel, and I would like to ask for a second of your time to subscribe, activate the notification bell, and like the video so that YouTube can take our story to more people who are passionate about stories like this. Thank you, and without further ado, let's continue with our story.
A deep sigh from the man made her stomach sink. "You have got to be kidding me," he muttered. As she scrambled to collect her things, her nerves tangled into knots. "I am so sorry," she babbled, attempting to wipe the coffee stain with the sleeve of her jacket, only making things worse. That's when she noticed the shattered remains of his phone at her feet. Her breath hitched. This wasn't just bad, it was career-endingly bad. The elevator doors dinged open, and the man, jaw tight, took a slow step forward. "You break things a lot, don't you?" he said, his voice eerily calm. Before she could answer, someone from behind whispered, Alisa, that's Ethan Fischer." Her blood ran cold. The Ethan Fischer? The billionaire CEO of Dax Corp? Oh, this was so much worse than she thought. She had barely caught her breath before the day continued spiraling out of control. In a feeble attempt to impress her new colleagues, she introduced herself with an overenthusiastic handshake, one that knocked a glass of water onto a keyboard. Laughter bubbled around her, some amused, some pitying. It wasn't exactly the first impression she'd hoped for. But, oddly enough, Ethan's reaction wasn't anger. Instead, he just observed her with an unreadable expression, as if trying to decide whether she was a tragic accident or a social experiment gone wrong. By lunchtime, she had earned a reputation. People chuckled when she walked by, some whispering about the intern who destroyed Ethan's phone, as if it were an urban legend in the making. Sitting alone in the cafeteria, she wondered if she should just quit before she got fired. Then, as if the universe wasn't done playing with her, Ethan walked in. The room seemed to hold its breath. With effortless confidence, he sat down across from her, sliding a new phone onto the table. "You owe me a phone," he said, "and maybe an explanation for why you of all people got hired." Alisa, despite her internal panic, felt something shift in the air between them. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't even annoyed, just intrigued. "Honestly, I have no idea," she admitted, laughing at her own misfortune. He tilted his head, studying her. Emotional story moments like these were rare in the corporate world, where everything was about efficiency and perfection. But here she was, messy and unpredictable, and yet still here. From that moment on, the office felt different. Sure, people still whispered, but the laughter was lighter, almost endearing. Ethan, despite his reputation as an unshakable businessman, seemed to pay more attention to her, whether she liked it or not. Maybe it was the sheer absurdity of their first encounter, or maybe, just maybe, something about her chaos was exactly what his structured world needed. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of something far more complicated than a spilled coffee or a broken phone. Because if today was any indication, Ethan Fischer wasn't just intrigued, he was watching, waiting, and perhaps even interested. Alisa's second day at Dax Corp wasn't any better than the first. Within hours, she managed to spill coffee on a stack of financial reports, mistook a board member for the janitor, and tripped over a chair while attempting to leave her room discreetly. Every time she thought she had hit rock bottom, she found a way to dig a little deeper. Her colleagues started placing silent bets on what she'd ruin next. But amid all the chaos, something unexpected happened. Ethan Fischer kept watching, not with frustration or anger, but with something dangerously close to amusement. It wasn't just her clumsiness that caught his attention, it was her mind. Alisa had a way of simplifying complex data into things people actually understood. Instead of calling a declining revenue chart Q4 loss projection, She labeled it the sadness chart. Instead of dry, technical summaries, she explained reports like she was telling a real story, funny, human, and weirdly insightful. Ethan had spent years surrounded by numbers and polished executives. Yet here was this whirlwind of unpredictability, making even financial disasters sound entertaining. One afternoon, while she nervously presented her findings in a meeting, Ethan sat back in his chair, arms crossed, watching. He barely spoke, just observed, letting her stumble through her explanations. The room expected him to tear her apart. Instead, he asked, "So what do you call this chart?" A beat of silence. Alisa glanced at the messy bar graph behind her and blurted out, the corporate anxiety index?" The room erupted in laughter. Ethan smirked. "Creative," he muttered. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something new in his eyes, curiosity. From then on, Ethan seemed to be everywhere. If she dropped a report, he picked it up before she could. If she made a self-deprecating joke about her incompetence, he was quick to correct her. "You're not incompetent. You're unconventional." And every time she made a mistake, he didn't scold her. He simply observed, as if trying to solve the puzzle that was her. But Alisa wasn't blind. She noticed how his presence changed. The cold, unreachable wasn't so distant anymore. And that was when the rumors started. Whispers filled the office. Some said Ethan was entertained by her. Others claimed he liked her. Alisa dismissed it all. He was Ethan Fischer, and she was just an intern. But when she caught him watching her in meetings, or when his expression softened, just slightly, when she messed up, she began to wonder. Maybe this emotional story wasn't as one-sided as she thought. Still, she had little time to dwell on it. Because just as her presence in Ethan's world started making waves, someone else began to take notice. Someone who saw her as more than just an amusing disaster. And someone who wasn't afraid to challenge Ethan for her attention. The whispers started as a low hum, quiet enough to be ignored, yet persistent enough to follow Alisa wherever she went. Colleagues exchanged knowing glances when Ethan lingered near her desk a little too long. The way his eyes tracked her movements, the subtle smirks, the quiet corrections when she fumbled through reports, it was fuel for office gossip. "The Ice King has a favorite," someone murmured near the break room. Alisa laughed it off, but deep down, she couldn't deny that something had shifted. And she wasn't the only one who noticed. Logan Pierce, a rival businessman with a reputation for being both charming and ruthless, entered the scene like a well-dressed storm. Unlike Ethan's controlled presence, Logan was all confidence and ease, flashing grins that made interns swoon and executives wary. He took an immediate interest in Alisa. Maybe it was her unpredictability, or maybe he just enjoyed challenging Ethan. Either way, it didn't take long for him to make his move. One afternoon, he cornered her near the elevators, offering her a job, one that came with a salary that made her breath catch. Ethan's reaction was instant. The moment he heard about Logan's offer, his usual stoic demeanor cracked, just enough for Alisa to catch a glimpse of something sharp beneath it: possessiveness. "He doesn't want you for your talent," Ethan stated, his voice lower than usual. "He wants you to get to me." Alisa scoffed, but the weight of his words settled in. Was Logan really interested in her, or was she just another piece on a corporate chessboard? And why did Ethan sound like the idea of her leaving was personal? The tension between the two men became impossible to ignore. Meetings were laced with subtle jabs, their conversations growing sharper whenever Alisa was in the room. Logan made sure she knew her worth, slipping casual compliments that made Ethan's jaw tighten. Ethan, on the other hand, grew colder, not toward her, but toward everyone else. The shift was subtle but undeniable. It was as if he was realizing, perhaps too late, that Alisa wasn't just another intern. She had become important to him. Alisa, caught between the storm of egos and unspoken words, felt the weight of their attention. Logan made her feel wanted. Ethan made her feel something else entirely. But how could she even begin to untangle her feelings when neither of them was saying what they really meant? The lines between rivalry and something deeper blurred, and Alisa found herself at the center of a silent battle, one she never signed up for. And then, just when she thought things couldn't get more complicated, Ethan made a move that left no room for doubt. Because for the first time since she met him, he stopped watching from the sidelines and stepped forward, ready to stake his claim before it was too late. Ethan Fischer was not a man who hesitated. He built an empire by making ruthless decisions, by controlling every aspect of his world. And yet, when it came to Alisa Martin, hesitation had been his biggest mistake. Watching Logan pursue her had been unbearable, but the real wake-up call came when he realized she might actually leave. The thought of Dax Corp without her chaotic energy, without her ridiculous nicknames for financial charts, without her, it was unacceptable. And so, for the first time in his life, Ethan ignored logic and followed instinct. Alisa had no idea what was coming. One moment, she was standing on the rooftop of Dax Corp, staring at the city lights, trying to make sense of the tangled mess of emotions inside her. The next, Ethan was there, looking at her with an intensity that made her pulse stutter. "I can't do this," he said, his voice rough, like the words were dragged out of him. She blinked. "Do what?" His jaw tightened. Pretend. Pretend like you don't mean anything. Pretend like watching you consider Logan's offer didn't make me want to tear the whole building down." Her breath hitched. Ethan Fischer, the untouchable CEO, was unraveling in front of her. "Then why didn't you say something before?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He took a step closer, and suddenly, the space between them felt too small, too charged. "Because I thought I could ignore it. That if I kept my distance, it would go away. But it didn't. It got worse." His hand brushed against hers, hesitant, almost unsure. A stark contrast to the man who commanded boardrooms without a flicker of doubt. Alisa's world tilted. This wasn't just a confession. This was something bigger, something she wasn't sure she was ready for. "Ethan," she started, but before she could form a coherent thought, he did something that knocked every ounce of logic from her mind. He dropped to one knee. The breath in her lungs vanished. "Marry me," he said, the words as steady as his heartbeat. No grand speeches, no rehearsed declarations. Just 3 simple words that carried the weight of everything he hadn't been able to say before. The city stretched wide behind them, but Alisa could only see him. Ethan Fischer, the man who had been an untouchable force in her life, was now kneeling in front of her, offering something more valuable than power or wealth: his heart. Her pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't just about a job anymore. This was about them. And deep down, she already knew her answer. But even as she opened her mouth to respond, a million thoughts raced through her mind. Because love wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. And if Ethan thought life with her had been unpredictable before, he had no idea what was coming next. Ethan Fischer never imagined that chaos could feel like home. Yet here he was, standing at the altar, watching Alisa walk toward him, radiant, breathtaking his. The woman who had once crashed into his world like a force of nature was now about to become his wife. As she reached him, a small, mischievous smile played on her lips. "Still time to run," she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. He smirked, fingers tightening around hers. Not a chance. The vows were exchanged, not just as promises, but as undeniable truths. From this moment on, his world would never be the same. Marriage didn't magically smooth out their differences. It made them sharper, more vivid. Ethan was methodical, precise, a man of control. Alisa was unpredictable, a whirlwind of ideas and last-minute decisions. But instead of clashing, they learned to balance. She pulled him out of his rigid routines, made him laugh at moments that would have once frustrated him. He grounded her, gave her stability without ever caging her spirit. Together, they became something stronger than either had been alone. And yet, just when they thought they had mastered their rhythm, life threw them a curveball. A year into their marriage, Alisa sat across from Ethan at dinner, her hands fidgeting in a way that immediately caught his attention. He lowered his fork, eyes narrowing slightly. "What is it?" She took a breath, then slid a small envelope across the table. Ethan opened it, pulling out a single ultrasound image. Silence stretched between them. His expression remained unreadable. Then, slowly, realization dawned. His breath left him in a rush. "We're having a baby?" His voice was barely above a whisper. She nodded, suddenly unsure. But before doubt could creep in, he reached for her, pulling her into his arms, holding on to her like she was his entire world. Parenthood was something neither of them had planned so soon, yet it became the most natural transition of all. Ethan, once consumed by corporate strategy, found himself obsessing over baby names and nursery designs. Alisa, who had spent her life stumbling through unpredictable moments, now had a purpose clearer than ever. Their lives, once dictated by board meetings and business deals, shifted toward late-night cravings, nursery preparations, and the quiet wonder of imagining a future they had never dared to plan. Real story moments like these had a way of redefining everything. As months passed, Ethan became someone no one had ever seen before. The cold, calculated businessman was now reading parenting books at 2 a.m., arguing with Alisa about whether their child would prefer stuffed bears or rabbits. And Alisa? She saw the man behind the title, someone who had never known how to love freely until she walked into his life and refused to leave. They had gone from accidental collisions to a love story neither of them had expected. And on the night their child was born, as Ethan held their newborn daughter in his arms, Alisa saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before: absolute, unshakable devotion. He had built his empire with strategy and control. But this was something he could never predict, never plan for. And yet, he wouldn't change a thing, because love had rewritten every rule he once believed in.